Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We got a very special guest today. Author of Supreme Disorder, constitutional lawyer, former Cato Institute member, Ilya Shapiro. How's it going?
Going well. Good to be with you. Interesting podcast you have here.
You think so? Give us a lowdown on who you are and your a brief history of Ilya Shapiro. How about
that? Sure. So I'm now I was with Cato for nearly 15 years. Then had what some have referred to as a brief but significant stint at the Georgetown University Law Center for the Constitution, where if you Google me, most of what comes up on the first page is how I tweeted. People didn't like my tweet criticizing President Biden's use of race and sex in his Supreme Court nomination criteria. I was ultimately suspended with pay while they investigated my tweet. They cleared me, but the report I got from the DEI, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office, made clear that my time was short. They were looking to fire me in the future for any time someone claimed offense to what I did. So I quit and have been using this moment, this spotlight I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia. Meanwhile, I joined the Manhattan Institute, where I direct constitutional studies, and I work at the intersection of the legal, political, academic, and media worlds. You mentioned the book that just came out in paperback, Supreme Disorder, on judicial nominations in the politics of America's highest court. I'm also working on a book now on the illiberal takeover of legal education. That'll be out about a year from now. And as we, learn, it seems like every week there's something. Most recently, the disruption of the speech by the federal judge at Stanford Law School. We can get into that if you like, but there's definitely weird, wild stuff going on in law schools and in broader higher ed.
Sure. I think it's just so easy to talk about this because, as you said, sitting at the intersection, I mean, think about it this way. It's one of the most, consequential positions in America is being involved in constitutional law of some sort, obviously, because it affects literally everybody. And a lot of those data streams, if you want to call it that, have kind of been captured by this identity politics stuff at this point. And, we've seen it in a lot of other areas, but I think it's very obvious the risk involved here because you're attacking something that is meant to be a meritocracy in order to uphold the rights of our citizens with nonsense, basically, right?
Yeah, that's to put it mildly. I mean, I would say that the DEI stuff, I mean, the words themselves are or should be unobjectionable, intellectual or other diversity, people with different perspectives to bring to bear on a problem, or equity, which is a centuries-old concept in Anglo-American law about courts being courts of equity and making fair rulings, that sort of thing. Fairness, who can object to that? Inclusion, people feel welcome. They should feel welcome, and that their worth is respected, whether it be at an employer or a campus or what have you. But those terms have been perverted, and indeed in an Orwellian way, they mean the opposite of what they actually are supposed to mean. And so these offices, these structures, these indoctrination sessions go against intellectual diversity, prevent equal opportunity, and exclude those who deviate from a rigid orthodoxy. And the result is that DEI fails on its own terms. That is, when we've seen surveys of campus climate, and students and professors feel less included, they feel less comfortable, less welcome, and feel that there's more tension, whether based on racial or other lines. And so you have this, I don't want to get into a correlation causation debate, but as the DEI officers have exploded in the last 5 years, we have a decline of campus culture.
Yeah, 100%. And it's in the same way that the catastrophizing that goes on in the broader culture, as Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff say in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, we're teaching kids to unlearn good lessons on how to cope, right? So we're teaching kids to catastrophize instead of mitigate. or mitigate the force that something that happened in our life might have. This is exactly what cognitive behavioral therapy teaches, right? But they're teaching the opposite. And in the same way, the censorship on campuses is achieving what I think is the primary goal of social programming, which is manufacturing consent. And a big part of that is to train people to self-censor, right? Like instead of, it looks very authoritarian for a governing body, whether it's the state or the dean of admission or the dean at a university or whatever it is, to say, hey, you can't say these things, or you can't, because when somebody says you can't say something, what they're really saying is you can't think that thing, right? That seems very outwardly authoritarian and obvious to a lot of people. But when you create a climate where, you're deputizing people to basically censor on your behalf, then it seems like, oh, that's just the culture now, right? And you're out of lockstep with the culture, or you're not. How do people like to put that? You're on the wrong side of history, I think, is
Right.
one of the common
Right.
phrases.
And you mentioned an interesting wrinkle there. Greg Lukianoff, John Haidt, who do, they're friends of mine. They do wonderful work.
Sure do.
Greg is coming out with a sequel, co-authored with Ricky Schlott, I believe her name is. She's an editor at the New York Post, called "Canceling the Canceling of the American Mind." But the key point from their earlier book from 5 years ago is, and John Haidt keeps writing on this. He has a book coming out too. Is the not just the left, right, or postmodern critical studies, critical race theory, what have you, but the therapeutic nature of what the bureaucrats in these and other offices are now bringing. And so to again invoke this disruption, this protest against the federal judge at Stanford last Thursday, the president and dean have since apologized to the judge. They haven't committed to taking any steps against the DEI dean that harangued him or the students or anything like that. But they also said, well, for those students in the Federalist Society who hosted his event, this is the conservative libertarian law students organization, we have resources to help you, to support you, that you can turn to, including the same DEI dean. But it's they don't need their hands held. They don't need this therapeutic behavior. It's not the the so-called harm from speech and threatening the existence. They don't believe that we should exist. All this kind of weird language. It comes from the world of therapy. And it's heterodox to the essential knowledge and truth-based, what should be the knowledge and truth-based mission of any institution of higher knowledge. It makes it very hard to fight against, because again, this is not just a continuation of conservative decades-old complaints about the left-wing takeover of the academy, Berkeley in the 60s or what have you. This latest mode is this weird postmodern therapized stuff. And finally, there is, starting to be a backlash, but it's we've gone on a tangent in our culture. Most people point to about 10 years ago or so, based on how kids are raised, based on social media, all sorts of different things. And it's a much more complicated story, therefore requiring more complicated remedies than simply a left-right rebalancing.
Sure, I don't buy into the whole left-right thing for a while now. I think it's been kind of used politically, I guess, since the Newt Gingrich era when he became speaker. I think that's kind of people look to a couple of years ago when the heat kind of turned up on this partisan stuff, but I think it was quite a bit before that, in my opinion. And you could tell. But I want to ask you said something to the effect of blurring the heterodoxy makes it more difficult to fight because you don't really know what you're fighting, right? And all of these kind of nefarious ideas are couched in very positive, and I didn't think about it before, but it certainly is therapy language. And that's nothing new. Look, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm not entirely sure what that does to fight inflation, right? You can just name a bill, whatever the fuck you want, and then do whatever. But one of the questions that I get a lot from people in our audience is, where do you go to find like legit information? And I think it betrays a broader problem with our society these days, which is that we may need a new epistemology. You know what I mean? Like, what does it mean for something to be correct, and what sources do we go to for that? Because if you look on social media, you're going to find, depending on if you're on Twitter or Facebook, different fact checkers saying different things, and we can't agree on what time of day it is or anything anymore. So, it used to be that academia was that. It used to be that constitutional law was that. It was a place where there were debates for sure, but at some point we came to some sort of resolution, or at least provided a series of possible explanations that we can study into the future. Now it is complete. It is a complete free-for-all. Nobody knows what's what. And that, again, to your point, blurring the heterodoxy like that makes it that is essentially an insurgency, right? That's why you fight an insurgency that way. You take your people out of uniform and you have them blend into the broader audience, but you can still feel the influence.
No, I think that's right. There's a dearth of critical thinking skills. I mean, colleges that are supposed to inculcate people with the ability to discern about what information is real or not, and yet it's those who are the most educated or the most credentialed that tend to reflect the biggest biases, both on the right and the left. Our discourse is in an echo chamber. It's enveloped in a toxic cloud, and we can't disagree without anathematizing the person we're disagreeing with, canceling, because the idea is, I think part of this is, as America has secularized, politics has replaced religion as kind of the font of to fill the hole in our souls that humans have craved since time immemorial. And then your political enemies, well, that they're not just wrong, they're evil. They're bringing sacrilege, and they're not their heretical thoughts aren't worth listening to. And that's I think it's become a religious struggle, without the theological dimension, really.
Sure, yeah, sectarian. I mean, it's it's I like that phrase. We can't disagree with someone without anathematizing them, because that to me is kind of Frank. We had a conversation with one of my buddies last week about this. His name's Rudy Reyes. He was a recon Marine. And he was talking about the indoctrination process in the Marine Corps and how they intentionally dehumanize you at first so they can rebuild you into what they want. But then when it's time to deploy, there are a lot of steps taken to dehumanize the enemy as well. And we call that battlefield preparation, right? In combat operations, that's what we call that. And, what kind of discourse do we have if it is contentious just for the sake of being contentious, right? I mean, it's that isn't really, it's certainly not a meritocracy. We're not going to arrive at any kind of answer. People just seem to get further entrenched in their own beliefs, which is, very interesting to me, because a lot of our fans are very conservative, libertarian. Some of them are libertarian. A lot of them are very conservative, and they still, I still see a lot of people supporting Trump, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that, but refusing to kind of articulate or even recognize some of the huge mistakes. I wonder from your perspective what that says about the broader culture. Like, if you as a constitutional lawyer, you got to be pretty objective. That's kind of the point, right? As a mathematician, you have to be pretty objective, as a physicist, so on. But as a political scientist, maybe not so much. Yeah.
Yeah, not willing to hear arguments, or as the facts change, as events progress, you have to figure out, adjust your own thinking as appropriate. And you would think the biggest knock against Trump would be that you want to win, don't you? No matter how right you think he might be, if he can't win, then that sort of defeats the whole point. But it's frustrating as an observer of the Republican Party that it seems like we're still arguing over the 2020 election rather than what's your prescription for the future. But that's a separate discussion.
Sure. And you're correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you are a libertarian. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not a big L libertarian. That party is probably even more screwed up than the Republican Party or the Democratic Party is. But I sometimes call myself a classical liberal. I mean, I'm a constitutionalist. Some people call me conservative, some people call me libertarian. I've give me the Federalist Papers and John Locke and the Founding Fathers and all that good stuff. Adding in some Goldwater and Reagan and some more modern authors, and that's about it. So somewhere in the I guess center right, but I don't like those labels either.
Yeah, yeah.
And in fact, the Manhattan Institute, Cato is an explicitly libertarian organization. Manhattan Institute doesn't label itself ideological. We talk about free markets and entrepreneurship and rule of law and things like that. And there's a broad spectrum, really. It's kind of interesting, of different kinds of people that work there. But classical liberal is probably the biggest umbrella that embraces most people.
Yeah, that's an interesting explanation, because when I ask, when people tell me they're libertarian, one, I don't know what that means sometimes, because some people who are nerdy about it are referring specifically to like Austrian economics, right?
Yeah.
And then some people who talk about it are just Republican Federalist. You know what I mean? People who respect the republic but want federalism, which is to say more power at the lowest possible level. So
or the shorthand used to be all in the pre-Trump era. Now if things are scrambled because there's libertarian populists, whatever that means. But some shorthand was Republicans or conservatives who smoke pot or who are gay or something like that. But that's yeah,
it makes sense. But yeah, certainly things are a lot different now, and I agree with you. I think it turns a lot of people off to the idea of classical liberalism, the Libertarian Party and how they operate. Frankly, a federal or national Libertarian Party doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. I don't get the point. I ask people that all the time, like, hey, at the LP National, especially on Twitter, I'm like, why do you think you need to exist? And they're like, well, to influence politics at a broader level. Like, that's not what libertarianism really is it? I get mixed responses from that, but
yeah.
So let's jump in a little bit. I want to ask you about the attack on. So we discussed the universities a little bit and how it's kind of being, not kind of, how it's been shifted culture wise into a place where you don't learn critical thinking, where it's not okay to ask pointed questions, or a place where you're certainly not going to get the benefit of the doubt or the principle of charity applied to your comments. And you've been through a very specific version of that at some point, and it led to a lot of things happening. So you were not thrilled about, as pretty much everybody who's listening to me right now, we're not thrilled about the idea that Biden, before nominating Ketanji Brown Jackson, specifically said that he would only consider candidates who were black women, right? Which is stupid, obviously, but you had something to say about that. You said that your comments were ineloquent, but I think it was pretty clear what you were trying to say. Just the PC.
Yeah, I was doom scrolling Twitter late at night, not a bad practice, and fired off a hot take, and didn't phrase it the way I would if I'm writing an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal or something like that. I used the phrase lesser black woman, in the sense that I thought, well, if I was a Democratic president, I would pick this judge, Sri Srinivasan, Chief Judge of the DC Circuit, who happens to be an Indian American immigrant as well. So we got diversity points and all that, but not according to the latest hierarchy of intersectionality. And so I said we'd end up with a lesser black woman, meaning everybody else, in my mind, if I've determined that this judge is the best, everyone else is lesser or less qualified. But that's how it turned out. And there was a big firestorm, especially on Twitter, of course. But who cares about Twitter? It wouldn't have mattered if I was just at Cato, but I was 5 days away from joining Georgetown, and so people called for my head, and it ended up, the dean called a more than 4-month long investigation, and it's farcical, really. And they ultimately determined they paid a big law firm a bunch of money, and finally some junior associate looked at the calendar and saw that I hadn't been an employee when I tweeted, and so all these policies under which they were investigating me didn't apply. But I celebrated that technical victory. But then when I read the fine print, they made clear that, and not just to me, they made clear to everyone that anytime you step out of line, then you're subject to discipline. So I thought I'm not going to be part of that, and I left. And it's, I didn't think I was naive going into my job at Georgetown. I speak on college and law school campuses a lot. I follow politics a lot. This is, I work at a think tank, and this is what I do. And yet, I just, for some reason, this still happened to me.
Mm.
And if it can happen to someone like me, I'm not Ben Shapiro. I'm not related, except back at Sinai, perhaps, despite our names. I'm not Milo Yiannopoulos or some of these other
Yeah.
rabble rousers that kind of just provoke for the sake of provocation. And if something like that can happen to me, then good Lord. So that's it's I haven't had to change any of my views for sure. I mean, I've been a free speech advocate and all that for a long time, but my career has definitely reoriented towards attacking this evil of the bureaucratization and the DEI postmodern theory that has taken over higher ed and other institutions. On top of them, I'm still doing my regular thing, filing briefs at the Supreme Court on the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Second Amendment and all these other things. But the reason you're interviewing me, the reason I get a lot of attention is because this is constantly in the news, and people care about education, both K to 12 and higher ed, a whole lot these days. I'm in all of the above when looking at solutions. So I proposed with Chris Rufo model legislation to defund DI structures and get rid of diversity statements and things like that. I've also talked to deans a fair bit and say, look, you're very good at inculcating the values of public service and inclusion and whatever else you want to inculcate as a law school dean. Well, you can go back to this bread and butter stuff about civil discourse and free speech and due process and things like that. I also, if judges want to boycott certain law schools because they're illiberal or they're hostile to speech, all power to them. I just think there need to be a heterodox pushback to this heterodox problem that we're facing.
Yeah, it's certainly we're on the decline in that regard, and it is good. I try to keep people informed on that because it's kind of hard to follow. You know what I mean? Like you hear a lot of anecdotal stuff about, oh, this conservative speaker got ran off campus, or this kid got suspended for this thing or that thing or whatever, but when you see the aggregate data, the policy in action, the opinions of people, and how it's enforced in academia right now, it is very problematic. I mean, we need smart people in this country. We need people that are smarter than the things we're building so they can continue building them. And I don't just mean engineers. I mean, social structures as well. And it seems like these folks are captured. What do you think that is? What pressure exactly does someone like Georgetown face that they have to do this? Because it seems like it's an intentional. Look, 10 years ago, you were a regular guest on MSNBC, and not in an ironic, we're bringing you on, not like we're bringing you on here to beat you up kind of way. It was because you're a fucking expert at what you do. You know what I mean? And now it's like probably not going to happen. They're just going to yell at you the whole time. So what do you? It seems like there's this concerted effort to classify everyone as something and draw lines between people and stuff like that. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it's just coincidental.
No,
it seems like that's intentional.
It's a skewing and narrowing of the Overton window, the permissible range of policy views. And it seems to be an impatience or an inability to grapple with opposing ideas. Anyone who challenges you, especially on issues declared sensitive, race, sex, but there are some others. And it's not necessarily, new stuff like, in a criminal law class, a lot of professors have abandoned teaching the law surrounding rape altogether because it's a minefield that they just can't navigate. I don't know what this says about the how. I don't think it's simply a matter, each generation says that the kids coming up behind them just, are terrible. The kids these days, people have been saying that since ancient Greece, right? There are writings of Plato and Aristotle about like the kids these days, they just don't get it. But it's something, it's more than that. It's the mollycoddling, and the placating of such illiberal tendencies by leadership. And not because university leaders, presidents, provosts, deans are all of a sudden social justice warriors or woke radicals. They're not. They're spineless cowards. And they see that there is a cost to going against the the illiberal radicals, and there's not to standing up to it. So, I mean, real change will come when the vast middle, or kind of the normal people, online they're called normies or what have you, but the people who just want to go about their lives and take care of their families, do their jobs, study, maybe have some fun in college, get a job at the end.
Mm.
Um, until that kind of average per ordinary person is activated and starts saying, this emperor has no clothes, and even worse, it's harming my experience and devaluing my credential and all the rest of it, which I think we're starting to see
Mm.
signs of. But that's really what's going to provoke change. It's not adding the marginal person to my center right broad umbrella coalition of classical liberals or whatever who
Mm.
are inside the beltway politically active already. No, it's about broader social change. And once these university leaders or corporate leaders, what have you, see that, that's actually a minority and there is a cost to going against what's in the majority's interests, that's when we'll see things change. And, I was a little too pessimistic 6 or 8 months ago. So I resigned from Georgetown just over, 8 months ago, 9 months ago, been with Manhattan about 8 months. And I was just, we've passed the point of no return. It's all bad, at least in academia. And just, it's such a moving target that just in the last month or two, we've seen things like a Wall Street Journal op-ed based on FOIA requests of documents at Texas Tech regarding their hiring in the biology department that's based purely on these diversity statements. And once this one op-ed came out, the next day, the president of the university said, no, we're not doing that. We're reevaluating all of our hiring. This is not appropriate. And same things happened with UNC, University of Texas, a number of schools that I'm learning that a lot of these structures, to mix metaphors, are Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to fight this asymmetric warfare, both in terms of the public, both on the behind the scenes, and we're learning. The illiberal kind of forces got a head start, particularly when everybody's minds were addled during the pandemic. But now we are definitely seeing pushback.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well. So, to fight back against this, if you're a reasonableist, I guess would be a good way to say that. Not the cult from Parks and Recreation, but an actual reasonableist. It makes sense to, if you're a conservative parent, maybe evaluate your choices, or not even conservative, just any reasonable human being. And you have kids getting ready to go to school. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. I mean, between the predatory student loans, and especially from the bigger universities and the Ivy League. I mean, Harvard, for example, has like a $33 billion endowment, and they make more money. They make 3 times more money annually on interest from their endowment than they do on tuition, which means theoretically they can make their tuition for free. Now, they're not going to do that. I don't know why it would be the best. I mean, not like anybody needs an additional reason to try to get into Harvard, but that would be a pretty good PR for them. But it's not. This isn't a situation where, stagflation or shrinkflation, where they're having to charge more for less of a product because of the economy. That's just simply not the case, right? What we see is professor salaries relative to inflation have gone up about 30% over the last 20 years, and all of the administrative, there's 2,000% more administrative costs now in the average university.
That's in doing research for my current book on the illiberal takeover of law schools, working title "Canceling Justice." The just striking bureaucratic bloat started off as general bureaucratic bloat, like lots of assistant deputy deans of this and that, then rock climbing walls and lazy rivers to compete with each other on amenities and things like this, which is ridiculous in and of itself, and should anger people given the rate of inflation, rate of tuition increase, and student loans and all that. But then starting about 10 years ago, and especially 5 years ago, the DEI aspect of that to the point where there was a survey of the 5 football power conferences, so fairly large universities, 65 of them. 16% of students at 4-year institutions in America attend these 65 universities in the power conferences. The average one of these universities has 45 DEI staffers. That's more than history professors. That's, 4 times more, 5 times more than people to help disabled students, that which is a federal requirement under the ADA. Just incredible expense going to what is a value subtracting proposition, as I mentioned earlier. This isn't about student organizations. If someone wants to have a Mexican folkloric dance club, have at it, right? Or a history of Black Pride or whatever. Student organizations, guest lectures, all of that is excluded. But just these organizations that segregate and inflame tensions have been driving so much of the cost increase. And I think ultimately that's what is going to, if it's taken down, it's going to be on that basis. Universities are going to be forced to have some skin in the game and say, you can pay for whatever you want, you can charge whatever you want, but you're going to have skin in the game in terms of these loans. If these students can't pay them back, you're going to be on the hook.
Yeah,
I think that's
one of the better solutions for this crisis we're in. And conservative people will say absolutely do not forgive any of these loans because for all the obvious reasons. And that's correct, probably, but it doesn't help the fact that 25 to 35-year-olds are no longer buying starter homes and fucking up our housing market. There aren't houses for $150,000 to $250,000 available any longer in anywhere near any major city because of that very factor, because there aren't buyers for those homes. That we have a lot of big problems. But one of the better solutions I've heard for it was if too many students from your university default on your loans, or if you're a bank that provides college loans and too many people default on them, then you're responsible as the bank or the academic institution. Like, you're setting people up for failure, right? That's not a marketable product. I'm not sure how much I want the government being involved in anything, frankly, because they're just going to take their scrape and move on. But that does seem a little more reasonable than the way we're doing things. And you have to think at some point that, well, we've been seeing it over the past year and a half or so, about 18 months. You're starting to see more and more employers remove the bachelor's degree requirement from just general employment. Tech companies and customer service companies and places like this are removing that requirement, including the federal government, by the way, recently did that for most positions. That to me is going to have a trickle down effect, probably, right? I mean, you would think so.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have anything else to add to that. I think that's a correct statement.
So you think the fluff is usually what goes when people have to start cutting their budget, right? And your position is probably that DEI is going to be on the cutting board.
We're seeing this in corporate America. There's layoffs in some sectors, and it seems to be in those DEI aspects of the HR offices that tend to go first.
Very interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, let's get into the show. Not that we haven't been shooting the shit for a while, but the purpose of the show is the reason it's called Citizen is because I think that my position is that you can either bitch and moan about your rights and wait around for the government or somebody else to secure them for you, and as such you will be a subject of whomever secures your rights, or you can secure them yourself through social citizen action, and that's when you become a citizen. And we have these principles that we like to kind of guide around because, having true north makes a lot of sense. To me, it's hard to get somewhere if you don't really know where you're going. So you picked 1, 7, and 11. We'll get into those. But the first one is I'll support and defend liberty against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Can you break that down for me and why it's important to you?
Sure. So one part of the Ilya Shapiro story that I didn't mention at the outset, kind of my personal background. I picked it up at I guess once I started as a big law refugee from decided corporate law wasn't for me a few years out of law school. I was born in the Soviet Union, and the only thing political we got out. We immigrated to Canada when I was 4. The only political thing my Soviet trained engineer parents taught me was that communism was bad, and I sort of took it from there. And the idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness sounded pretty good, even better than the Canadian peace, order, and good government, which is why I eventually immigrated again to the U.S., which is a whole other discussion. I like to say that, like most immigrants, I do a job that most native-born Americans won't, and that's defending the Constitution. Um,
It's good.
but I've made a career of defending liberty across a host of dimensions in various ways. Working for the nation's premier libertarian think tank for nearly 15 years, and all that. Didn't have a chance to serve in the armed forces again for immigration status reasons, but I did spend a few months in Iraq in '07 as a civilian legal advisor to the Judge Advocate General, the Chief Judge Advocate, rather, the head JAG, who was advising General Petraeus at the time on rule of law issues. So, yeah, I feel like that's the Constitution, the American experiment, was instituted to protect liberty of various kinds, including for religious weirdos in New England, including for all sorts of frontiersmen and those fleeing the old world's rigid requirements and what have you. And through the modern day, the American dream, although it's morphed, still remains. Just last night with the Oscars, which I didn't watch,
Mm-hmm.
of course, because it's a bunch of ridiculousness, but the man who won the supporting actor category, the Vietnam was a Vietnamese boat refugee back in the day, and he talks about this is the only country where you go from that to being on this Hollywood stage. So that's beautiful, and those examples still happen, and that's what I've from a policy and legal perspective, what I've worked on.
I want to that he's short round, by the way, from Indiana Jones. It's the same
Yep.
kid, which
Yep.
is amazing. He should have got a fucking Oscar for that performance, frankly. But yeah, that was I enjoyed his speech, and we talk about this a lot, but first generation Americans are that's who I like. That's who I listen to for opinions on what it's like in other countries, not people who are like, oh, America sucks, because a little perspective is always nice to have. I've spent quite a bit of time in Baghdad, for example. Not a fucking sweet place to be under any circumstances. It's pretty horrible. But yeah, I think this idea of defending liberty, it seems to me people have very shallow understanding of the Constitution and of what liberty really is. You know what I mean? Because when pressed hard enough, people will often veer towards authoritarianism, frankly. It's like if you're somebody's doing something you don't like, that's the best time to apply the liberty principle, right? Because it's none of your fucking business what they're provided they're not hurting anybody else. But I feel like understanding exactly what liberty is and what the American system, I guess what the American promise is, because I had a conversation with somebody about this last week, and when I talk to people who are very critical of the United States history, like the 1619 people, they say America needs to be rebuilt from scratch because of all the failures. My position is, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this because you're a literal expert in this field, but my position is that the American system of government was built to be a self-correcting one. They were limited by not just the information, I guess, but they were limited by the political scene, maybe. They were limited by popular opinion at the time to do the right thing, which is to say, immediately outlaw any kind of slavery or oppression. And that's not an excuse for the founders, but here's what I find interesting about it. They built a system where over enough time, that problem would self-correct, and any other problem that pops up would self-correct, right? So when I hear people say something like, well, yeah, the Constitution says, or the Declaration of Independence says all people are created equal, and the Constitution gives these rights to people. Those rights didn't apply to black folks or women or whomever else at the time. It's like, yeah, that's correct. Those were mistakes. And those mistakes were corrected by the very system you're trying to tear
wasn't
down.
necessarily mistakes. It was also compromises to get the Constitution
Sure.
in place in the first place, because they were half slave states. They they made the compromise that they needed to, and we ended up not being able to resolve that without fighting a great war that fundamentally restructured our constitutional order.
Yeah, and 100%. And my position is that even in the beginning, the framers knew that this was going to be a problem. I mean,
Yep.
uh,
Yep.
uh, Franklin and even Jefferson, who owned more slaves than anybody, was on record that slavery was an abomination, oddly enough. But um, I think the system of government we have, when applied correctly, is pretty good. It is designed to be self-correcting. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. I know we fail quite a bit, but that's kind of the
Well,
purpose.
so there's an amendment process, obviously, and Jefferson also said that maybe the Constitution's only good for a generation. That
Mm.
every generation we need a revolution. That was some of his more outlandish ideas, I suppose. But every generation should and does have the freedom to amend the Constitution, which used to be done a lot more often. These days we think of amending the Constitution. Well, you only do that for world historical things like ending slavery or
Mm.
giving women the right to vote or maybe legalizing the income tax. Huge, super huge things, but it doesn't have to be that way. And the reason we think that now is because in the New Deal, especially, the Constitution was effectively amended without going through the amendment process. FDR, writing to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, said, "Don't let any concerns about the constitutionality of this legislation, no matter how well founded, detract you from voting it in." They knew what they were doing. Or Social Security in the depths of the Depression. If you couldn't get the supermajority you need to allow Social Security in the Depression, well, maybe it's not the best idea then. If at the time, when people were struggling and starving, and maybe go back to the either get that reform through the Constitution, it probably would have passed, or you're doing it the wrong way. And so you're right. The Constitution is more flexible than a lot of people give it credit for. It's thought of as this outmoded thing. Well, it's not frozen in amber. It was amended. The post-Civil War amendments. It's not like those are aberrations. That's how the system's supposed to work. Yeah, outlawing slavery, the 13th Amendment, obviously big, huge. But then what did the 14th Amendment do? It changed the relationship between the citizen and the state, and the states and the federal government, gave Congress certain powers to enforce civil rights. That's very different than the original Constitution. So it's not just what Jefferson and Madison and Washington and Hamilton thought in
Mm.
1789 or what have you. It constantly gets and can get updated for each modern age. But we've forgotten about that, and the court over time has allowed Congress to get away with abdicating its responsibility to be the place where we resolve our clashes of values or policy views, in the sense that Congress passes, the Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Act of 2023, and then when some deputy undersecretary of whatever department issues a regulation under that piece of legislation and someone's hurt by it, and they go to their congressman and say, "How could you vote for this?" And the congressman says, "No, I voted for truth, beauty, and goodness. Your beef is with the bureaucracy," which then gets sued, which then the Supreme Court ends up at the end of the day having to resolve the half a dozen of the biggest political controversies in our life every June, and there's protesters in front of the Supreme Court instead of in front of Congress, which is ass backwards when you think about it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, certainly that process, it was put into place and made somewhat difficult, right? For a very specific reason. That is to say, or I'm sorry, the reason is that you need consensus and the will to do it. You need both of those things. You need people to agree for the most part to the tune of about 65% or 70% or whatever it is. And then you need the will to actually do it. Like a lot of people agree on a lot of stuff. And it's like, that doesn't really matter. I'm not doing that. I wonder from your perspective as a constitutional attorney, what some folks would challenge the idea that it's a living document. I think that's historically been proven to be the case, frankly, because that's how we treat it. So it doesn't really matter if there was intent about that or not. But how do we know what to keep? Like if you're talking to a constitutional originalist, they want every letter, every period to be the same forever, that's a viewpoint.
That's not right. That's not right. To be an originalist is to say you interpret what's in the Constitution based on what was the public meaning when enacted. It does not necessarily expressing a view on what should be changed through the Amendment 5 constitutional process.
Yeah. So your position then is
Article 5 amendment process.
Right. Yeah. Your position is that the term originalist applies to somebody who wants the original intent, not necessarily the exact original
The
meaning.
original meaning. So this is some confusion about what originalism means as
Mm,
well. It's not about what James Madison thought about violent video games that try to get into his head and use a Ouija board or something. It's what do those words mean and
mm,
how do we apply them given the what are we to make of a reasonable search or seizure in the world of digital surveillance? Well, you analogize to anyway. This is what lawyers do. This is what
mm,
judges do. It's not an automatic kind of you plug things into a computer and you get your result. There's still lots of room for and should be for human judgment. But the question of what should be changed, that's a completely separate debate. I went through a process through the National Constitution Center, which is a very interesting institution based in Philadelphia. They have a gorgeous museum with statues of the Constitutional Convention and all. It's right across, right on the same plaza as Independence Hall, where the Constitution was hammered out. And there were teams of conservative, progressive, and libertarian legal scholars, and we debated what changes to make to the Constitution, and ultimately were able to agree on certain ones. Term limits for Supreme Court justices in exchange for fixing the number at 9, making it easier to impeach executive officials, not just the president, but just anyone who derogates their
mm,
duty in various ways. Nothing huge and cataclysmic, as you can't get conservatives and progressives to agree on what the rights are or whatever,
mm.
but certain structural changes that people might be surprised to hear that there can be consensus among people that disagree on things like guns and abortion or whatever else that people think are the most contentious. It was an interesting exercise, and you can go on their website and take a look at all of that. So there are different ideas, and you can look at each team's proposed amended constitution without trying to achieve consensus. So this is things that people do think about. The Constitution's not perfect, even though I think it was pretty darn good,
Mm.
even as it started out, and the amendments, other than the progressive era amendments, we don't think direct election of senators and income taxation and prohibition, right? That not so good ideas, but anyway, that's a separate question. How would we improve certain things? One thing I would do, and this doesn't even take a constitutional amendment, is enlarge the number of congressmen. These days, each congressman represents something like 700,000 people, which is, not the way accountability is supposed to work. And that's why we have these debates over gerrymandering and all the rest
Mm.
of it. We should have 10 times the number of congressmen. It would cost a little, but it's penny wise rather than being pound foolish. And you'd have them being closer to the people. You wouldn't have, if there's some eccentrics or radicals. I mean, who cares? They're one of 1,000 people
Mm.
or whatever, they 3,000 people. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, I wonder. I'm definitely going to check into that. That little exercise that you described, because that sounds really fascinating. You consider yourself to be more on the classical liberal or whatever side. Whatever words don't mean anything anymore.
I
Uh,
was the captain of Team Liberty, as we called it.
oh yeah, there we go. So Team Liberty then. What's Team's Liberty position on the Second Amendment?
We're in favor of it. I mean, it's one of the natural rights going back to the Enlightenment time, the right to armed self-defense. Yeah, anyway, we can go into the way that should play out in jurisprudence. And it's not something that I come from in terms of that I was raised with or something, right? I came from Russia, I came to
Mm.
Canada, I've lived in cities all my life, but it's uh, anyway, that's the overview.
Well, that's pretty brief for an overview, right? I mean, do you have specific opinions? I think the biggest debate, if you want to call it a debate, I don't think it's really a debate any longer. It's just kind of mudslinging, but a fundamental disagreement in what a militia is, right? Whether they were broadly referring
Yeah,
to the general public or if it was like specifically targeted towards the National Guard, which is what a lot of people argue.
Yeah, I don't think it's the National Guard. It was, I mean, at the in colonial times, all able-bodied men between the ages of I think 16 and
Mm,
64 were part of the militia, could be called up, or were expected at least to have serviceable firearms if need be. More relevant really is what the meaning of our individual rights was in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was enacted, because the concern there was less overarching government tyranny of the kind at the revolution, and more the disarming of political minorities, whether freed blacks, whether Union sympathizers in the South, Confederate sympathizers in the North, Asians in the West, all these different folks who were being dispossessed of their firearms, and then it was much easier to oppress them economically and
mm,
in other ways. And so the individual right conception for self-defense was even stronger when Congress, what lawyers call incorporated the Bill of Rights against the states, including the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you have a right to a personal tank or ICBM or something? It gets kind of complicated there, because I think it really refers to firearms in common use
mm.
in common civilian use. There's so much misinformation or misunderstanding of what an assault weapon is and all these things, and it's not Dianne Feinstein, the longtime highest ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. Basically, anything that scared her was an assault weapon. Was the colloquial definition.
Yeah.
But it's whether you have a black machine gun looking type of arm, an AR-15, doesn't affect its rate of fire or muzzle velocity or caliber of rounds that it fires or anything like that. So that's a red herring. But
Hmm.
there are no right is absolute, and you can have time, place, and manner restrictions. Just like free speech is very important. Political speech is at the core of the First Amendment. Doesn't mean I can go into your neighborhood at 3 in the morning and shout exactly what I think of Joe Biden and Donald Trump through a bullhorn, right? That can be stopped. Similarly, there can be regulation of the right to arms, but it does exist. It's an individual right, and it's what most people want it for is fine. And by the way, that's not hunting. The core of the right is not hunting or
Mm.
sports shooting. It's self defense.
Yeah, I think that's the best take, to be honest, on all this. People get pretty tuned up about it. I get it. I mean, if you feel like somebody's trying to attack you from one way or the other, you're going to get pretty tuned up about it. But a good time to be calm and rational and reasonable is when everybody else is not those things. So keep that in mind when you're having this debate, folks, because it is, history is pretty much on our side in that regard. The next principle you chose is I'll promote equality of opportunity, not outcome, particularly when I'm in a position of power and wealth. Why did that one jump out to you?
Well, this goes to the DEI debate that we've been talking about. Equality of opportunity is so important. That's what America promises to people. That's why they want to come here. In so many places, the rules are stacked against them. It's either arbitrary rule by the aristocratic class of people, or you're discriminated against based on some historical thing or your race or whatever it is. America has, at least on paper and how its laws are written, guarantees the equality of opportunity. The opposite is equality of outcome, and for that you have to hobble people. It's like the Harrison Bergeron, the short story
Hmm.
by Kurt Vonnegut, where the best dancers had to wear weights on their ankles, and the smartest people had to wear these headphones that had a constant annoying buzzing, so they couldn't focus properly. Just so to equalize. It's a very communistic
Hmm.
way of doing things. We think of communism as equalizing wealth, but if you think about equalizing talent or outcome, that's what trying to guarantee equal outcome is, and that's what the E part of DEI, the equity,
Hmm.
has so harmfully been become to stand for.
Why do you think it is that people are so focused on this specifically right now? Because it used to be that we respected people because of their resilience, right? Like somebody would tell you their story and they wouldn't say, well, I've got ADHD and came from a single parent home, so I'm not doing that great. People instead would say, well, I had some struggles, but here are my accomplishments, and that would be their identity rather than the latter part. So I wonder, why do you think that changed over time? Because it's
It
very
seems to
bizarre
be
to me.
another, yeah, no, it seems to be another example of this, therapizing of public policy. You know, we can't acknowledge that people have different experiences or inborn talents or what have you. That seems unjust. And so if there are unequal outcomes, it must be because of some structural injustice in the world that we need to remedy in some manner. And just removing the actual barriers isn't enough, or even providing remedial services isn't enough. You went to a bad high school, and well, rather than just making sure you get extra tutors over the summer before college or something like that, we need to you know I don't know what, equalize all the grades or get rid of grades, or it's bizarre, and it's gotten to the point where, in the name of equity, again, going to higher ed because I'm just thinking about that so much these days,
Mm.
getting rid of SATs or LSATs for law school, MCATs for medical school, it has the perverse effect of hurting equity, in the sense that those standardized tests were put in there so kids from underprivileged backgrounds at crappy schools could show that they were just as smart as the rich kids getting all of the extra support, because it's hard to compare GPAs, and AP
Mm.
classes aren't offered everywhere and all that. But if you score on this objective test, which despite money thrown at it, it's harder to game than providing extracurriculars to throw up on your
Mm.
on your resume and whatnot. Getting rid of that will make it harder for kids that have that tough Scrabble background to succeed.
It also makes people more suspicious of their success, which is very
Yes.
unfortunate, because
Yes.
I hate when somebody looks at a successful person and goes, "Man, you're really lucky. You got a great life." It's like, it's not luck, dude. I've been working my ass off a lot for a very long time to achieve this, and I think it casts this shadow of doubt over, and maybe not for the individual, but generally speaking for the institution. It definitely is appropriate, I think, because it comes back to epistemology. We just don't have a true north anymore anywhere in our culture. One thing that everybody looks at, and I thought for a while it was like harming children. That would be the one thing where nobody would ever allow that in our society. It would be a taboo thing to even speak of, and clearly that's not the case, because now, just to virtue signal, people are taking their children to these like drag shows to watch a grown man wag his genitals in front of children. So I thought that might be the last barrier, but it seems like there's nothing left.
What I don't get about this quote unquote debate over drag queen story hour is, it's not like 10, 20 years ago, before trans rights or
Mm.
whatever, people took their kids to strip clubs and
Yeah.
to see biological women twerking or
Mm.
something. I mean, it's just not a thing. So I don't know why. It's fine to teach your kids to accept people as they come or what have
Mm.
you, but in this manner, I think it's the drag part more than the queen part that people are objecting to.
It's very bizarre. Yeah, I can't put my finger on why it is, because look, it's not like kids are doing this on their own. They're not signing up for this and then going to it. Their parents are taking them and sitting
No.
there with them through the performance, if you want to call it that. But I thought that would be the last bastion of some kind of consensus on what is and is not appropriate as an adult human being in a Western society to do, right? But we don't even have that any longer. So I wonder how we're going to get back to this. How are we going to get back to everybody being able to look at something and identify the objective realities in that thing, even if they disagree on the circumstance or on the meaning of that thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it does devalue legitimate achievements.
Mm. So the last one is, I will live a life worth dying for. And we get a lot of pretty disparate responses to this one because people have different life experience. But I wonder from your perspective what that means to you.
Um, I want to live a meaningful life. I want to leave it all on the field. I want people narrowly construed, this sentence might be, is what I'm doing worth the sacrifice of those who die in war to defend my freedom and stuff like that. But I think it means much more than that, in the sense that if I died today, would my family, or could I, objectively look back and say that this was a life well lived? I remember I first encountered this phrase, or at least that I can consciously remember, a life well lived, as the biography, the video biography of a British actor, Paul Eddington, who played the minister and then the prime minister in Yes Minister, Yes Prime
Mm.
Minister. This show, which is much beyond, before there was West Wing or Veep or any of these other political shows, was just a brilliant send up of the relationship between politicians and bureaucrats. UK specific, sure, but a lot of good
Mm.
insights there, as well as brilliant comedic acting. But anyway, his biography, the video biography, was entitled, documentary was entitled "A Life Well Lived." And I ever since that, I keep encountering the phrase every now and again. Just last week I went to a memorial service of the husband of a friend who died all too young, tragically, age 48, pancreatic cancer, and was just a pillar of his community, an entrepreneur. I know his wife because she's a law professor and we're in similar professional circles there. And she worked with my wife in the government and all these different things. But I'd never actually met her husband, but um, just a remarkable individual by all accounts. There's hundreds of people overflowing the space, came to this memorial service, including several judges, and Justice Thomas was there, whom she had clerked for. And what people talked about, was just, a life well lived. And, hopefully I don't go at 48. Hopefully I have a, longer, fuller life, get to meet my grandkids. I have 4 kids now under age 7, so we're in the thick of it here. But that's, a life of meaning, not wasting time, not wasting opportunities, and trying to use your God-given gifts and talents, along with the training that your parents and others imbued to you, and whatever else, the whole confluence of a life experience, to do the most you can to advance principles that are important to you. And that's what I'm trying to do. And a gloss that came on that in my last year with my so-called lived experience with Georgetown is that I'd always been a big fan of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the dissident Soviet writer. And he had an important article speech entitled "Live Not by Lies." Let the lie triumph, but not through me. And that's certainly become an additional mantra, an additional aspect of this idea that I want to live a life well lived.
That's really interesting. So, one of the things I talk about a lot is that in any society throughout human history, the aristocracy will very commonly protect the aristocracy before any particular institution or principle, because it matters to them to be separate from the rest of people, I think. But from your perspective, it's kind of the inverse. You are way more dedicated to the institution or principle, the value of the institution, not the institution itself, but the fact that the institution does the right thing and provides the right service. In this case, the institution being constitutional law or academia or whatever. I think that's the appropriate way to think about things, right? Like it's
Well, I mean, I want to protect my family first of all. I mean,
certainly,
we kind
yeah.
of have these circles of influence and generosity and attachment. And I believe in family communism, right?
Mm.
It's not like I'm demanding that my 4-month-old twins contribute as much as they get or anything like that. And we run a somewhat authoritarian household. I guess my what do they say, that the man is the head and the woman is the neck, or something like that, and that's certainly the case. But yeah, I'm committed to certain ideals. I'm very cognizant that my parents sacrificed to get me into this society where I can take advantage of opportunities and be the best. They didn't care what I went into or what I studied, as long as I work hard and I tried to be the best that I could be in that. And that's important to me. I'm trying to instill that in my kids, and I will be for sure as they get older. But that's what it means for me. I'm dedicated to my family, but beyond that, I want to live a life of integrity and impact.
Mm. It's a really good answer. Look, I appreciate your time today. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our audience before you get out of here? Anything you're reading or anything you got for people to read from your catalog as well?
Lately I've been reading this journal called Sapir, Sapir. It's kind of Jewish focused, but it's, part of it's religious, part of it's secular, part of it's, cancel. There's a cancel culture issue. There's a social justice issue. They're all the fascinating publication. I read anything I can get.
Mm.
Although these days it's hard because I'm writing so much and traveling and trying to read kids books to my kids as well and help them read and things like that. But a lot of my thoughts, I write a fair bit for media
Mm.
organizations that you can recognize, Newsweek and Wall Street Journal and National Review and whatnot. Stuff that doesn't make it for a conventional op-ed like that, I put in my Substack, Shapiro's Gavel. So whether it's my ruminations on the Super Bowl or Bull Durham, or my experiences nearly getting canceled but not quite at the University of Denver last week, or the analysis of a Supreme Court opinion or something like that. You'll find lots of good stuff there, and there, of course, is an unpaid and a paid option.
Mm.
So hopefully that's worth your listeners' while.
Absolutely. Look, again, thanks for coming today. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Yes, sir. And thank you all for listening. Make sure you check out Ilya Shapiro's books, check out his blogs, check him out in the media, and be a good citizen.